The sound of splintering wood echoed through the grand dining hall as the massive oak beams groaned under the weight of Charleston's heaviest rainfall in decades. William Barrett had exactly 3 seconds to look up from his brandy before 2 tons of timber and slate came crashing down, burying the wealthy plantation owner beneath what had once been his pride and joy. But this wasn't an accident. This was 15 years of calculated revenge, executed by the one man Barrett trusted most with hammer and nail. Moses Carter had spent months weakening every support beam, every joint, every connection that held that ceiling together, and tonight nature would provide the final push he needed to settle an old debt written in blood and blood: bondage. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story begins, not with the collapse, but with the construction, 15 years earlier, when Moses Carter first arrived at the Barrett plantation in 1818. He was 22 then, his massive hands already calloused from years of working wood, his dark eyes holding secrets that would take decades to unfold. William Barrett had purchased Moses for $800 at the Charleston slave market, not for his back like most men, but for his mind and the magic he could work with timber. Moses possessed what the other carpenters in Charleston called the gift, an almost supernatural ability to see the grain of wood, to understand how trees wanted to be shaped, and to coax beauty from even the most stubborn piece of lumber. He could build anything: furniture that would last centuries, houses that would weather the fiercest storms, but more importantly, for Barrett's purposes, he could build them faster and better than any white carpenter in the state. Barrett's mansion stood on Meeting Street, a 3-story monument to Southern wealth, with columns that reached toward heaven and rooms spacious enough to host Charleston's elite. But Barrett wanted more, always more. His wife Eleanor had died, giving birth to their stillborn son in 1825, and in his grief and guilt, Barrett threw himself into expanding the house, as if adding rooms could somehow fill the emptiness that echoed through the halls. Moses became Barrett's instrument of architectural ambition, forced to work from dawn until well past sunset, crafting elaborate additions that showcased Barrett's wealth to Charleston society. The breakfast room with its hand-carved wainscoting, the library with its soaring ceiling and intricate crown molding, the grand staircase that curved like a woman's spine, all bore Moses's touch, though none would ever bear his name. The relationship between master and slave was complex in the way that all such relationships were, built on a foundation of ownership that neither man could escape. Barrett recognized Moses's talent and treated him better than most masters treated their property, allowing him to keep a small portion of the money earned when Barrett rented Moses's services to other wealthy families. Moses slept in the carriage house rather than the slave quarters, ate better food than the field hands, and even learned to read by lamplight after Barrett's children had finished their lessons. But privilege, even the small privileges granted to a favored slave, could never erase the fundamental truth of Moses's existence. He was property, a thing owned, a tool to be used for another man's profit and pleasure. Every morning he woke to the sound of Barrett's voice calling his name. Every day he bent his creative gifts to serve another man's vision. And every night he returned to quarters that were comfortable for a slave, but would have been considered a shed for any free man. The turning point came in the winter of 1831, during the construction of what Barrett called his greatest project yet, a massive dining hall that would serve as the centerpiece for Charleston's social season. The room was to be 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, with a vaulted ceiling supported by hand-hewn oak beams that Moses had selected personally from trees that had stood for over a century. Barrett had invited Moses to walk through the planned space before construction began, a rare gesture that Moses initially interpreted as respect for his craftsmanship. They stood in what would become the center of the room, Barrett gesturing grandly as he described his vision for elaborate dinner parties and social gatherings that would cement his position among Charleston's aristocracy. "This will be your masterpiece, Moses," Barrett had said, his hand resting on Moses's shoulder in what might have seemed like a friendly gesture to anyone who didn't understand the dynamics at play. "When people see this room, they'll know that William Barrett owns the finest carpenter in all of South Carolina." The word "owns" hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Moses nodded and spoke the words that were expected of him, but something shifted in his heart that day. A weight that had been pressing down for years, suddenly becoming unbearable. He was not a craftsman in Barrett's eyes, not an artist or a builder, but a possession, no different from Barrett's horses, or his silver, or his fine china. Construction of the dining hall began in the spring of 1832, and Moses threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even Barrett. He spent hours selecting each beam, examining every joint, planning the complex network of supports that would hold the massive ceiling in place. The other slaves watched him work with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing that Moses was pushing himself beyond even his considerable limits. What they couldn't see was the plan taking shape in Moses's mind, a design within a design that would take more than a year to complete. As he fitted each beam into place, Moses made subtle alterations to the traditional construction methods he had learned over the years. Joints that should have been secured with both dowels and wedges were held together with dowels alone. Beams that should have been anchored directly into the load-bearing walls were connected through intermediary supports that could be weakened without detection. The modifications were invisible to anyone who didn't possess Moses's deep understanding of structural engineering, and Moses was careful to make them in places where Barrett's occasional inspections would never be per curs. Reveal the truth. The dining hall was completed in the fall of 1832, and Barrett declared it the finest room in Charleston. The ceiling soared 20 feet above the polished pine floors, supported by massive oak beams that gleamed with the careful attention Moses had given them. Crystal chandeliers imported from France cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the room could comfortably seat 40 guests around the enormous table that Moses had crafted from a single enormous cypress tree. Barrett hosted his first grand dinner in the new hall on Christmas Eve of 1832, inviting Charleston's wealthiest families to admire his architectural triumph. Moses watched from the kitchen doorway as the guests praised the beauty of the room, their voices echoing off the high ceiling that he had secretly designed to fail. The irony was not lost on him that he was serving the very people who would attend his owner's funeral, should his plan succeed. Throughout the winter and spring of 1833, Moses continued his regular carpentry work while secretly implementing the second phase of his plan. During routine maintenance visits to the dining hall, he gradually weakened the connections he had purposefully made vulnerable during construction. A tiny amount of water applied regularly to specific joints caused the wood to swell and contract, loosening connections that already bore more weight than they were designed to handle. Metal brackets were carefully filed down until they held together through friction alone. Support beams were hollowed out in places where the damage would never be visible, but would significantly reduce their load-bearing capacity. The work required patience and precision that tested even Moses's considerable skills. Too much damage too quickly would cause the ceiling to collapse before Moses could escape. Too little would mean the roof might hold indefinitely. He needed the structure to fail at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, with exactly the right person beneath it. Barrett's habits made the timing easier to predict than Moses had initially hoped. Every evening after supper, Barrett retired to the dining hall with a bottle of French brandy and his account books, spreading his papers across the great table while he reviewed the day's business. He would sit in the same chair every night, directly beneath the largest of the overhead beams, the one that Moses had most carefully weakened. Barrett claimed the solitude helped him think, but Moses suspected the ritual was more about surrounding himself with symbols of his wealth and power. The summer of 1833 brought unusual weather to Charleston, with heavy rains that seemed to arrive every afternoon like clockwork. The moisture in the air was exactly what Moses needed for the final phase of his plan, as the wood in the ceiling began to respond to the humidity by swelling and contracting in ways that put additional stress on the already weakened joints. Moses began making his preparations for departure in early August, though he was careful not to alter his routines in any way that might attract Barrett's attention. He sold the few possessions he had been allowed to accumulate over the years, converting them to coins that could be easily carried and wouldn't attract questions. He memorized the schedule of ships departing Charleston's harbor, paying particular attention to vessels bound for Caribbean ports, where a man with his skills might find work, and where the long arm of American law enforcement couldn't reach. The plan required Moses to time his escape with precision that left no room for error. He needed to be far enough away from the plantation when the ceiling collapsed to avoid suspicion, but close enough to Charleston to board a ship before anyone realized he was missing. The window of opportunity would last perhaps 6 hours, from the time he left the plantation until Barrett's body was discovered and the alarm raised. On the evening of August 15, 1833, Moses made his final preparations. The weather reports indicated heavy rain was expected throughout the night, exactly the conditions he needed to ensure the ceiling would fail. He had spent the afternoon making final adjustments to the weakened beams, using a technique that involved loosening connections just enough to ensure they would fail under the additional stress of water-soaked wood, but not so much that they would collapse before Barrett took his usual position beneath them. Barrett followed his evening routine with the clockwork precision that Moses had observed for months. Supper was served at 7 o'clock. Barrett retired to the dining hall at 8:30 with his brandy and account books. And by 9 o'clock, he was seated in his usual chair, directly beneath the beam that Moses had spent over a year preparing for this moment. Moses waited in the carriage house until he heard the first drops of rain beginning to fall on the roof, then made his way quietly toward the main house. He had memorized every creaking board in the floors, every door that squeaked on its hinges, every sound that might alert Barrett to his presence. The storm was beginning to intensify, with thunder rolling across the Charleston sky and rain drumming against the windows with increasing force. The dining hall windows glowed with warm lamplight as Moses approached from the garden side of the house, and through the glass he could see Barrett hunched over his papers, completely absorbed in his calculations. The scene struck Moses as fitting. Barrett surrounded by the symbols of wealth built on the backs of enslaved people, about to be crushed by the very craftsmanship he had exploited for so many years. Moses positioned himself where he could observe the dining hall ceiling while remaining hidden in the darkness outside. The oak beams were beginning to groan under the stress of the moisture-swollen wood, and Moses could see slight movement in the connections he had weakened. The sound of straining timber was masked by the storm, but Moses's trained ear could detect the subtle changes in pitch that indicated imminent structural failure. At exactly 10:47 by the clock on Barrett's mantelpiece, the first joint gave way with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. Barrett looked up from his papers just in time to see a small shower of plaster dust fall from the ceiling, but before he could react, the second joint failed, then the third. And suddenly the entire network of supports was coming apart in a cascade of destruction that had been 15 years in the making. The massive center beam, the one Moses had most carefully prepared, dropped first, striking Barrett across the shoulders and driving him face first into the table. The impact shattered the brandy bottle and scattered papers across the room, but Barrett had no time to cry out before the remaining beams followed, crashing down in a symphony of destruction that buried him beneath 2 tons of cry, oak, and pine. The collapse took less than 10 seconds from the first crack to the final settling of debris, but Moses remained motionless for several minutes, watching for any sign of movement beneath the wreckage. When he was satisfied that Barrett was indeed trapped, possibly dead, beneath the fallen ceiling, Moses turned away from the house and walked calmly toward the road that led to Charleston's harbor. The storm provided perfect cover for his escape, with rain falling so heavily that anyone with sense was staying indoors. Moses had prepared for this journey by studying every street and alley in Charleston, and he made his way through the city without encountering another soul. The ship he had chosen, a merchant vessel called the Freedom's Dawn bound for Port-au-Prince, was scheduled to depart with the morning tide, and the captain was known to ask few questions about passengers who paid in beret, advance, and kept to themselves. By dawn, Moses was standing on the deck of the Freedom's Dawn as Charleston harbor fell away behind him, watching the sun rise over a city where he had lived as a slave for 15 years and where he would never return. The ship's other passengers were mostly merchants and a few families relocating to Haiti for business opportunities, and none of them paid particular attention to the quiet black man who kept to himself in the cheapest cabin, the low deck. News of Barrett's death didn't reach the harbor before the ship's departure, and Moses spent his first day of freedom watching dolphins play in the ship's wake, while Charleston grew smaller and smaller on the horizon. He felt none of the celebration he had expected, none of the joy that should have accompanied his liberation. only a deep exhaustion that seemed to settle into his bones like the weight of years he would never recover. The voyage to Haiti took 6 days, and Moses used the time to transform himself from Moses Carter, enslaved carpenter of Charleston, into Matthew Freeman, skilled craftsman seeking opportunity in the Caribbean. He had chosen the name carefully, Matthew for its biblical significance as a man who left his old life behind to follow a new calling, Freeman for obvious reasons that needed no explanation. Haiti in 1833 was a nation still recovering from the revolution that had ended slavery 30 years earlier. But it was also a place where a black man with skills could make a living without constantly looking over his shoulder for slave catchers. Moses found work within a week of arriving in Port-au-Prince, helping to rebuild churches and schools that had been damaged in recent earthquakes. The work was satisfying in ways that Moses had almost forgotten were possible, as he could take pride in creating buildings that served the community rather than glorifying the wealth of his oppressors. His reputation as a master craftsman spread quickly through the Haitian capital, and within a year, he had established himself as one of the most sought-after builders on the island. But freedom, Moses discovered, was more complicated than he had imagined during his years of planning his escape. The guilt he felt over Barrett's death was unexpected and persistent, not because he regretted his actions, but because he wondered if he could have achieved his freedom through less violent means. The nightmares came regularly, dreams in which he was back in the collapsed dining hall, watching Barrett die beneath the beams he had weakened, feeling the weight of that death on his conscience in ways he hadn't anticipated. The news from Charleston reached him through ship captains and merchants who traveled between the islands and the American coast. Barrett's death had been ruled an accident, the result of poor construction techniques and unusually heavy rains that had weakened the roof beyond its capacity. The investigation had been brief and perfunctory, as there seemed no reason to suspect foul play in what appeared to be a straightforward structural failure. Moses's disappearance had been noted, but without any evidence connecting him to Barrett's death, the authorities assumed he had simply taken advantage of the chaos following his master's demise to escape to freedom. Rewards were posted for his return, but the descriptions were vague, and the search efforts half-hearted, as tracking down a single escaped slave was not considered worth the expense when there was no evidence of wrongdoing. Barrett's estate was sold to pay his debts, and the plantation was broken up among several buyers who showed little interest in pursuing the former owner's missing property. The other slaves were sold at auction, scattered to plantations throughout South Carolina and Georgia, their lives disrupted but continuing in the same patterns of bondage that had shaped Moses's existence for so many years. As months turned to years, Moses found himself becoming genuinely integrated into Haitian society in ways he had never experienced in America. He married a woman named Celeste who ran a small bakery near the harbor, and they had 2 children who would grow up free in ways their father had never known. The family lived in a house that Moses had built with his own hands on land that he owned, a concept that still sometimes struck him as miraculous, even years after gaining his freedom. The carpentry business thrived as Haiti's economy gradually recovered from decades of war and political instability. Moses trained apprentices in the traditional techniques he had learned in Charleston, but he also taught them something more valuable, the pride that came from working for themselves rather than enriching others. His workshop became a gathering place for craftsmen throughout Port-au-Prince, a center of learning and community that bore no resemblance to the isolation he had experienced as Barrett's property. Yet the memories of Charleston never completely faded, and Moses found himself thinking often about the other slaves he had left behind, wondering what had become of them and whether his escape had somehow made their lives more difficult. He sent money when he could through intermediaries, anonymous contributions that helped purchase the freedom of individual slaves or support the families of those still in bondage. The dining hall that had been the instrument of Barrett's destruction and Moses's liberation was never rebuilt. The new owners of the property found the cost of clearing the debris and repairing the structural damage too expensive, and the room remained a sealed tomb, its doors locked and its windows boarded over. Neighborhood children whispered that it was haunted by Barrett's ghost, and adults crossed themselves when they passed the house on Meeting Street. But Moses knew there were no ghosts in that room. only the echoes of choices made by desperate people in desperate circumstances. He had used his skills to create something beautiful that served his own purposes rather than his master's. And while he regretted the necessity of violence, he could not regret the freedom it had purchased. In 1848, 15 years after his escape, Moses received news that South Carolina had passed new laws, making it easier for free blacks to purchase the freedom of enslaved relatives. He used a portion of his savings to buy the freedom of 3 people he had known on Barrett's plantation, a gesture that cost him nearly everything he had earned, but provided a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The rescued individuals joined Moses in Haiti, where they found the same opportunities for dignity and self-determination that had allowed him to rebuild his life. One became a teacher, another a merchant, and the third followed Moses into the carpentry trade, learning not just the technical skills but the pride that came from ownership of one's own labor. As Moses grew older, his story became part of the folklore that Haitian parents shared with their children, a tale of intelligence triumphing over oppression and patience, defeating immediate gratification. The details were embellished with each telling, the timeline compressed, the dramatic elements enhanced, but the core message remained consistent. Freedom was worth any price, and sometimes justice required taking matters into one's own hands. Moses lived to see slavery abolished in the United States, though he never returned to American soil. He died in 1872 at the age of 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had known only freedom. Their lives a testament to the courage of a man who had risked everything to escape bondage and had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The dining hall in Charleston was finally demolished in 1885, when the property was sold to developers who planned to build modern townhouses on the site. Workers clearing the debris found Barrett's skeleton still pinned beneath the massive center beam, along with the remains of his account books and the brandy bottle that had shattered in the collapse. The discovery briefly renewed interest in the circumstances of Barrett's death, but by then, Moses Carter was remembered only as a footnote in the property records, an escaped slave whose whereabouts had never been determined. What those investigators could never have known was that every beam in that ceiling had been a carefully crafted instrument of liberation. Every joint a declaration of independence, and every weakened connection, a statement that some forms of ownership were simply unsustainable. Moses had built his own freedom into the very structure of his oppression, and when the time came, he had brought it all crashing down with the precision of a master craftsman who understood that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can build is an escape route. The legacy of Moses Carter lived on not in the buildings he had constructed for William Barrett, but in the children who grew up free in Haiti, in the former slaves whose freedom he purchased with his earnings, and, in the example he provided that intelligence and patience could overcome even the most entrenched systems of repression. He had proven that a man could be enslaved in body, but never in spirit, and that given enough time and determination, even the most powerless person could engineer their own liberation. In the workshops of Port-au-Prince, master carpenters still tell the story of the slave who built his freedom into a ceiling and brought down his master's house, beam by beam. They teach their apprentices not just the technical skills of working wood, but the deeper lesson that every tool can be an instrument of liberation for those with the wisdom to use it properly. The sound of hammers and saws in those workshops carries echoes of that night in Charleston, when Moses Carter chose freedom over safety, justice over security, and the uncertain promise of a life lived on his own terms over the comfortable slavery that had defined his existence for so many years. But the story of Moses Carter was far from over, and the ripples of that night in 1833 would continue to spread in ways he could never have imagined. In 1851, 18 years after Moses had vanished into the Caribbean night, a young journalist named Jacob Richardson arrived in Charleston to research a series of articles about antebellum architecture for the Atlantic Monthly magazine. Richardson was particularly interested in the structural engineering techniques used in Southern mansions, and his research led him inevitably to the Barrett property on Meeting Street, where the mysterious collapse of an elaborate dining hall had become something of a local legend. Richardson's inquiries drew the attention of Marcus Whitmore, Barrett's former overseer who had managed the day-to-day operations of the plantation. Whitmore was 73 years old and living in reduced circumstances, his savings depleted by poor investments, and his health failing after decades of exposure to South Carolina's humid climate. He agreed to meet with Richardson at a tavern near the Charleston waterfront, drawn by the promise of payment for his recollections, and perhaps by a desire to finally tell someone the truth about events he'd kept secret for nearly 2 decades. "You want to know about Moses Carter?" Whitmore said before Richardson had even finished explaining his research. "Everyone who asks about that house eventually wants to know about Moses Carter. Most folks think he was just another runaway slave who took advantage of his master's death to escape. But I knew Moses better than anyone except Barrett himself. And I can tell you there was more to that man than people realized." Richardson settled back in his chair, his notebook ready, sensing that he was about to hear something that would transform his architectural survey into something much more significant. Whitmore's roomy eyes focused on something beyond the tavern walls, seeing not the bustling port of 1851, but the plantation as it had existed in his youth. "Moses came to us when he was barely more than a boy, but he had hands that could make wood sing," Whitmore continued. "Barrett paid $800 for him, which was considerable money for a slave in those days. But Moses was worth every penny and more. He could look at a tree still growing in the forest and tell you exactly what it would be good for, could design furniture in his head that would take other craftsmen weeks to plan on paper." Whitmore paused to take a long drink from his whiskey glass, his hands shaking slightly with age or emotion. "But there was something else about Moses, something that made me nervous from the very beginning. He watched everything, remembered everything, and he thought about things more deeply than most white men I knew. Barrett treated him well by the standards of the time, gave him privileges that other slaves would have killed for. But I could see in Moses's eyes that privileges weren't the same thing as freedom." The old overseer leaned forward across the scarred wooden table, lowering his voice despite the noise of the crowded tavern. "The night that ceiling came down, I was in my cottage about a quarter-mile from the main house. Heard the crash clear as thunder, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. By the time I reached the dining hall, Moses was gone. His bed hadn't been slept in, his few belongings were missing, and there wasn't a trace of him anywhere on the property." Richardson's pen moved quickly across the pages of his notebook, capturing not just Whitmore's words, but the emotion behind them. "Do you believe Moses's disappearance was merely coincidental with the ceiling collapse?" Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey as if the amber liquid held answers to questions he had been asking himself for 18 years. "I've had a lot of time to think about that night, and I've reached conclusions that might surprise you. Moses didn't just happen to escape when that ceiling fell. Moses made that ceiling fall." The journalist's pen stopped moving. "Are you saying you believe Moses Carter deliberately caused the structural failure that killed William Barrett?" "I'm saying Moses Carter was the finest carpenter in South Carolina, and if anyone could design a ceiling to collapse at exactly the right moment, it would be him," Whitmore replied. "I went back and examined the wreckage after we pulled Barrett's body out, and what I saw didn't make sense for an accidental failure. The beams had been weakened in specific places. Joints had been compromised in ways that wouldn't have been obvious during construction, but would have made the entire structure unstable over time." Richardson felt his pulse quickening as he realized the implications of what Whitmore was suggesting. "If what you're saying is true, this would be one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance by an enslaved person ever documented. The planning required, the technical knowledge, the patience to execute such a plan over months or years. Moses was extraordinary in every way," Whitmore agreed. "He could have been a great architect or engineer if he had been born free and white, but instead, he was trapped in a system that saw him as nothing more than a very valuable tool." Barrett never understood that treating Moses better than other slaves didn't change the fundamental fact that he owned another human being. The conversation with Whitmore led Richardson to other sources, plantation records that had been preserved in Charleston's Historical Society, ship manifests from the harbor master's office, and correspondence between Barrett and other wealthy families who had employed Moses's services. A picture began to emerge of a man whose skills had made him famous throughout the region, but whose legal status had prevented him from ever benefiting from his own talents. Richardson's research also uncovered evidence that supported Whitmore's theory about the dining hall collapse. Technical drawings that Moses had prepared for other construction projects showed an understanding of structural engineering that was remarkably advanced for his time. Load calculations written in Moses's careful handwriting demonstrated knowledge of mathematics that few formally educated engineers possessed. Most tellingly, several letters from Barrett to business associates mention Moses's uncanny ability to predict when buildings would develop structural problems, a skill that would have been invaluable for someone planning to cause such problems deliberately. The journalist's investigation took him beyond Charleston to other cities where Moses had worked on various projects during Barrett's frequent loans of his services to friends and business partners. In Savannah, he found the ruins of a warehouse that had collapsed in 1830, killing the owner who had been cheating workers of their wages. In Columbia, he discovered records of a church that had suffered a mysterious fire in 1820. 9. Burning down the office where the pastor kept records of parishioners who had helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Each incident had occurred when Moses was known to be working in the area, and each had targeted someone who had committed acts of particular cruelty or injustice. The pattern was subtle enough that no one had connected the incidents at the time. But Richardson's systematic approach revealed what appeared to be a long campaign of carefully planned retribution. The most startling discovery came from a ship's manifest Richardson found in the Savannah Port records. The Freedom's Dawn had indeed departed Charleston for Port-au-Prince on August 16, 1833, exactly one day after Barrett's death. Among the passengers listed was one Matthew Freeman, described as a free man of color, traveling to Haiti to establish a carpentry business. The physical description matched what Richardson knew of Moses Carter's appearance, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Richardson's investigation eventually led him to correspond with contacts in Haiti, where he hoped to learn whether Matthew Freeman might have been Moses Carter under an assumed name. The response he received from a merchant in Port-au-Prince confirmed his suspicions and provided details that transformed his understanding of the story entirely. Matthew Freeman had indeed been well known in Haiti, not just as a skilled carpenter, but as a leader in the community of former American slaves who had found refuge on the island. He had established a school where he taught both carpentry and literacy to young men who had escaped from bondage, and he had used his earnings to purchase the freedom of dozens of enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. But the most significant revelation was that Freeman had kept detailed journals throughout his life in, quote, Haiti, documents that had been preserved by his family and that contained what appeared to be a full confession of his activities in South Carolina. According to the merchant who had examined the journals, Freeman had not only admitted to causing Barrett's death, but had provided technical details of how he had accomplished the seemingly impossible task of engineering a ceiling collapse that would appear accidental. Richardson's excitement at this discovery was tempered by the realization that the journals were in the possession of Freeman's grandson, who was understandably reluctant to share documents that could potentially incriminate members of his family, even posthumously. It took months of negotiation and the payment of a substantial sum to gain access to the journals. But what Richardson found in those pages exceeded his wildest expectations. Moses Carter, writing as Matthew Freeman, had documented not just his plan to kill Barrett, but his entire philosophy of resistance against slavery. The journals revealed a man who had spent years studying the weaknesses of the system that oppressed him, identifying opportunities for sabotage and retribution that would advance the cause of freedom while appearing to be accidents or natural disasters. The dining hall ceiling had been only the culmination of a much larger campaign of what Moses called invisible warfare, acts of resistance so carefully planned and executed that they left no trace of human intervention. He had weakened tools that plantation owners used to punish slaves, causing them to break at crucial moments. He had introduced flaws into the construction of slave quarters that made them more comfortable in winter and cooler in summer. Improvements that appeared accidental, but were actually carefully calculated gifts to his fellow bondsmen. Most remarkably, Moses had developed a network of communication with other skilled slaves throughout the region, sharing techniques for subtle sabotage that could improve conditions for enslaved people without alerting their masters to deliberate resistance. The network had operated for over a decade, spreading what Moses called liberation through craftsmanship to plantations across South Carolina, and Georgia. The journals also revealed the emotional cost of Moses's activities, the nightmares and guilt that had plagued him even in freedom, and his constant fear that his actions might have led to increased surveillance and punishment for other slaves. He had agonized over the morality of his methods, questioning whether violence could ever be justified, even in the service of liberation. But he had ultimately concluded that the system of slavery was itself so violent that any response was morally acceptable. Richardson's findings created a sensation when they were published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1852, sparking fierce debates about the nature of resistance to slavery and the extent to which enslaved people had agency in their own liberation. Abolitionists praised Moses Carter as a hero who had used his intelligence and skills to strike a blow against oppression, while defenders of slavery condemned him as a terrorist who had abused his master's trust, commit murder. The publicity surrounding Richardson's articles also attracted the attention of Frederick Douglass, who was at that time one of the most prominent voices in the anti-slavery movement. Douglass had himself escaped from bondage and understood the desperation that could drive someone to take extreme measures in pursuit of freedom. He wrote extensively about Moses Carter's story, arguing that it demonstrated the intellectual capacity of enslaved people and their right to resist oppression by any means necessary. Moses Carter did what the law would never do, Douglass wrote in an editorial for his newspaper, The North Star. He brought justice to a man who had grown wealthy by denying freedom to others. He used the very skills that slavery had sought to exploit for its own liberation, turning the master's investment in his bondage into the seed, instrument of his escape. The debate over Moses Carter's legacy continued to rage throughout the 1850s, becoming part of the larger national conversation about slavery that would eventually lead to civil war. His story was cited by both sides, abolitionists as evidence of the intelligence and dignity of enslaved people, and slavery advocates as proof of the dangers of treating slaves with too much kindness or allowing them to acquire skills that could be turned against their owners. Meanwhile, in Haiti, the man who had been Moses Carter continued his quiet work of building a free community for former slaves. The publicity surrounding Richardson's articles had made him briefly famous, but he refused all requests for interviews or public appearances, preferring to let his work speak for itself. He continued to purchase the freedom of enslaved people when possible, and his carpentry school had trained dozens of young men who carried his techniques and philosophy to other parts of the Caribbean. The school itself had become something of a marvel, a complex of workshops and dormitories that Moses had designed to demonstrate the possibilities of architecture created for liberation rather than oppression. The buildings were beautiful but practical, designed to be easily expanded as the community grew and equipped with hidden passages and concealed storage areas that could provide shelter for refugees from slavery. Every aspect of the construction reflected Moses's belief that buildings should serve the people who used them, rather than proclaiming the wealth and power of their owners. As tensions in the United States moved steadily toward war, Moses found himself increasingly involved in efforts to support the Underground Railroad and other networks that helped enslaved people escape to buy freedom. His workshop became a hub for maritime operations that spirited refugees from southern ports to Haiti and other safe havens. And his technical expertise proved invaluable in designing concealed compartments in ships and creating documents that could pass official inspection. The irony was not lost on Moses that his skills as a carpenter, originally forced into service for a master who saw him as property, had become the foundation for a freedom network that challenged the entire system of caste. Slavery. The same hands that had built Barrett's dining hall now crafted freedom ships, and the same mind that had engineered a ceiling collapse now designed escape routes that saved hundreds of lives. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought new challenges and opportunities for Moses and his community in Haiti. The Union's desperate need for skilled workers created opportunities for free blacks to serve in support roles, and many of Moses's former students left the island to contribute their skills to the war effort. Moses himself, now 65 years old, and showing the effects of decades of hard physical labor, remained in Haiti but contributed financially to Union causes and continued his work of purchasing freedom for enslaved people whose owners were willing to sell rather than risk losing their human property to military action. The news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Haiti in early 1863, and Moses gathered his extended community to hear the document read aloud in the workshop where he had taught so many young men the skills they needed to build lives of dignity and purpose. The moment was bittersweet, a vindication of everything he had worked for, but also a reminder of how long the struggle had taken and how many people had suffered while waiting for freedom to arrive through legal channels. As the war continued, Moses began to receive letters from former students and other members of the Caribbean Freedom Network who had returned to the United States to participate in Reconstruction efforts. They wrote of the challenges of building new communities for formerly enslaved people, of the resistance they encountered from whites who refused to accept the end of slavery, and of the desperate need for schools, churches, and other institutions that could serve free black communities. The requests for Moses to return to the United States and lend his expertise to Reconstruction efforts were frequent and heartfelt, but he consistently declined, explaining that his commitment was to the community he had built in Haiti and to the continuing work of providing refuge for those who still needed to escape American racism. At nearly 70 years old, he had earned a right to enjoy the peaceful life he had created, but more importantly, he understood that his greatest contribution lay in maintaining the example of what was possible when black people were truly free to develop their talents without constraint. Moses's final major project was the construction of a cathedral in Port-au-Prince, a massive undertaking that would serve as both a place of worship and a symbol of what former slaves could accomplish when their abilities were allowed to flourish. The building took 5 years to complete and incorporated architectural innovations that Moses had developed over his decades of work, techniques that maximized natural light and ventilation while creating spaces that inspired rather than intimidated those who entered. The cathedral's dedication in 1868 drew visitors from across the Caribbean and from the United States, where Moses Carter's story had become legendary among both black and white communities. Frederick Douglass himself attended the ceremony, finally meeting the man whose story he had championed for over a decade. The two spent hours in conversation, discussing the various paths that resistance to slavery had taken and the challenges that lay ahead as formerly enslaved people worked to build new lives in freedom. "You chose the hardest path," Douglass told Moses during their meeting, "but perhaps it was also the most necessary. You proved that we were never the property others claimed us to be, that our minds and souls belonged to us regardless of what the law said about our bodies." And Moses's response revealed the humility that had always characterized his approach to his own story. "I was fortunate to have skills that provided opportunities for resistance that others didn't have. But every person who maintained their dignity in slavery, who protected their family, who helped others when they could, was fighting the same war I was. I just happened to have tools that could bring down a ceiling." The conversation between the two men was recorded by a journalist who was covering the cathedral dedication. It had provided insights into Moses's personality and philosophy that had been missing from earlier accounts of his story. Despite the attention his story had received, Moses remained focused on practical matters, discussing techniques for building schools and workshops that could serve free communities, sharing plans for water systems and sanitation improvements that could improve public health, and offering to train young architects and engineers who could carry his methods to other parts of the world. Moses Carter died peacefully in his sleep in 1872, surrounded by the large extended family he had created through decades of welcoming refugees and former slaves into his community. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, directly or indirectly, through his work as a carpenter, teacher, and freedom fighter. The cathedral he had built served as the site for the service, its soaring interior filled with voices raised in songs that celebrated both his life and the freedom he had helped so many people achieve. The eulogy was delivered by one of his first students, a man named David Laurent, who had arrived in Haiti as a terrified teenager fleeing slavery in Louisiana, and who had become one of the island's most successful merchants under Moses's guidance. Laurent spoke of Moses not as a hero, in the dramatic sense that many people preferred, but as a teacher who had shown by example that freedom was something that had to be built, day by day, choice by choice, with the same patience and skill that went into constructing a building that would stand for centuries. Moses taught us that every hammer blow could be an act of liberation if we chose to make it so. Laurent said. He showed us that the same hands that had been forced to build monuments to oppression could also build schools for our children, homes for our families, and churches where we could worship as free people. His greatest legacy is not the ceiling he brought down, but the community he lifted up. The impact of Moses Carter's story continued to reverberate long after his death, inspiring generations of craftsmen, architects, and engineers who saw in his example proof that technical skills could be used as tools for social justice. His methods were studied in the engineering schools that began admitting black students after the Civil War, and his philosophy of building for liberation rather than domination influenced the development of community-centered architecture throughout the Americas. In the late 19th century, several of Moses's former students returned to the United States to participate in the construction of historically black colleges and universities, bringing with them techniques and approaches that had been developed in the freedom workshops of Haiti. The buildings they created reflected Moses's belief that architecture should inspire and uplift those who used it, with designs that emphasized natural light, open spaces, and integration with the surrounding landscape. The Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker Washington in 1881, was particularly influenced by Moses's educational philosophy, with its emphasis on combining practical skills training with moral education and community development. Washington himself cited Moses Carter as an inspiration, praising his combination of technical excellence and social commitment as a model for what black education could accomplish. As the 20th century dawned, Moses Carter's story took on new significance for civil rights activists who were fighting against the Jim Crow laws and segregation policies that had replaced slavery as methods of racial oppression. His example of using intelligence and patience to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles resonated with leaders who were developing their own strategies for challenging unjust systems. W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, included Moses Carter among the historical figures who demonstrated the talented tenth of black leadership that he believed could guide the race toward full equality. Du Bois was particularly impressed by Moses's combination of practical skills and intellectual sophistication, seeing in him an example of the kind of educated leadership that could challenge white supremacist assumptions about black capabilities. The story of Moses Carter also found new audiences during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, when black writers and artists were celebrating African American achievements and exploring themes of resistance and empowerment. Langston Hughes wrote a poem called The Carpenter's Revenge that retold Moses's story as a parable about the power of patient planning and skilled execution, while Claude McKay's novel The Falling Beam used the dining hall collapse as a metaphor for the inevitable collapse of all systems based on the exploitation of one race by another. During World War II, Moses Carter's story took on new relevance as black soldiers fighting against fascism abroad questioned why they should accept segregation and discrimination at home. The image of a skilled craftsman using his abilities to strike a blow against oppression resonated with men who had learned technical skills in the military and who returned home determined to use those skills to build better communities for their families. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s found particular inspiration in Moses' example of long-term strategic thinking and careful preparation. Martin Luther King Jr. referenced Moses Carter in several speeches, praising his patience and intelligence, while also using his story to illustrate the dangers of forcing people to choose violence as their only path to freedom. Moses Carter waited 15 years to strike his blow for freedom, King said in a 1963 speech in Charleston, delivered not far from the site where Barrett's mansion had once stood. He used those years to perfect his plan, to develop his skills, and to prepare for the moment when he could act decisively. We must have that same patience and that same determination, but we must also ensure that people do not have to wait 15 years for justice." End quote. The speech was delivered just months before King's famous "I Have a Dream" address at the March on Washington, and many historians have noted similarities between the two presentations, particularly in their use of historical examples to illustrate contemporary struggles and their emphasis on the connection between individual courage and collective liberation. As the civil rights movement achieved major legislative victories with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Moses Carter's story evolved once again, becoming less a tale of necessary violence and more a celebration of intellectual achievement and technical excellence. The focus shifted from his role in Barrett's death to his accomplishments as an educator and community builder in Haiti, with emphasis on the schools he had built and the lives he had transformed through education and by opportunity. This evolution reflected broader changes in how American society understood the history of slavery and resistance. With increased recognition of the intelligence and agency that enslaved people had demonstrated even under the most oppressive conditions, Moses Carter's story became part of a larger narrative about the ways that Black people had always fought for their freedom, using whatever tools were available to them, and never accepting the dehumanization that slavery attempted to impose. The story of Moses Carter entered the 21st century as both a historical account and a continuing inspiration for people working for social justice in various forms. His combination of technical expertise, strategic thinking, and moral commitment appealed to activists, engineers, and educators who saw in his example a model for using professional skills in service of larger social goals. Architecture schools began including Moses Carter's story in courses about the social responsibilities of design professionals, using his career to illustrate how buildings and construction techniques could either reinforce systems of oppression or contribute to human liberation. Engineering programs similarly used his example to discuss the ethical obligations that came with technical knowledge and the importance of considering the social implications of professional work. The dining hall collapse that had made Moses Carter famous was re-examined using modern forensic techniques, and experts confirmed that the structural failures showed clear evidence of deliberate sabotage carried out by someone with sophisticated understanding of load-bearing systems and material properties. The precision required to weaken the ceiling in such a way that it would collapse at the right time and in the right manner was recognized as a remarkable feat of engineering, all the more impressive for having been accomplished without the mathematical tools and computer modeling available to modern professionals. Moses Carter's journals, finally made available to scholars in their entirety, revealed the depth of his thinking about resistance, freedom, and the relationship between individual action and social change. His writings showed a man who understood that his personal liberation was meaningless unless it contributed to the broader struggle against slavery, and who had dedicated his life to proving that the intelligence and creativity of Black people could not be contained by legal bondage. Perhaps most remarkably, the journals documented Moses's network of communication with other skilled slaves throughout the South, revealing a sophisticated resistance movement that had operated for decades without detection. The network had shared not only techniques for sabotage, but also methods for education, community organizing, and mutual support that had helped countless people survive the horrors of slavery with their dignity intact. The full scope of Moses Carter's influence became clear only as historians gained access to previously hidden documents and oral histories that had been preserved in Black communities throughout the Americas. His students and their descendants had carried his techniques and philosophy to dozens of countries, establishing schools, workshops, and community organizations that reflected his belief in the power of practical education combined with social commitment. Today, Moses Carter is remembered not just as the slave carpenter who brought down his master's ceiling, but as an educator, innovator, and community leader whose influence extended far beyond the dramatic moment that first brought him to public attention. His story serves as a reminder that resistance to oppression takes many forms, that intelligence and patience can be as powerful as physical courage, and that the tools used to maintain unjust systems can also be used to tear them down. The workshop he established in Port-au-Prince continues to operate today, though it has evolved into a technical institute that serves students from throughout the Caribbean and beyond. The curriculum still includes traditional carpentry and construction techniques, but it has expanded to embrace modern engineering, sustainable design, and community development methods that reflect Moses Carter's belief that technical education should serve human liberation rather than merely economic advancement. In Charleston, A historical marker now stands near the site where William Barrett's mansion once dominated Meeting Street, commemorating not the wealthy planter who built his fortune on slave labor, but the enslaved carpenter whose intelligence and determination proved that no system of oppression could permanently contain the human spirit. The marker does not shy away from the violence of that night in 1833, but it places Moses Carter's actions in the context of a larger struggle for human dignity that continues to this day. The story of Moses Carter reminds us that history is shaped not only by the famous and the powerful, but also by ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice as permanent and who use whatever tools they possess to build a better world for themselves and their communities. His hammer and saw became instruments of liberation, his knowledge of wood and stone became weapons against oppression, and his patient planning became a model for all who seek to transform society through intelligence, skill, and unwavering commitment to human freedom. In the workshops of Haiti and the engineering schools of America, in the community centers built by his students and the technical institutes inspired by his example, the sound of hammers and saws continues to carry the echo of that night when Moses Carter chose to bring down a ceiling and, in doing so, helped to bring down an entire system of human bondage. His legacy lives on in every building constructed to serve rather than dominate, in every skill shared freely rather than hoarded for profit, and in every act of resistance that proves the unconquerable nature of the human desire for freedom and dignity.